Hi, welcome back. I'm John Tabler, and in this video, we're going to do a really cool experiment. I'm going to use baking soda in sourdough bread. And you know, people used baking soda in the past for what they call leavening. It's really not leavening in the traditional sense that it breaks down the gluten and makes the nutrients more assimilable. But over the years, leavening has just really come to be called getting air into the bread. And there's so much more of a purpose for it with sourdough traditionally from ancient times. But there's a baking soda and baking powder called Clabber Girl. And I just did a quick print of it. I thought it'd be quicker. And it's actually still is the #1 baking soda that is in the United States. And you would think Arm & Hammer is, but actually Clabber Girl is it. But why is it called Clabber Girl? That doesn't sound too attractive. So Clabber is actually fermented unpasteurized milk. And that's what cheese and other things in the past were made from. And actually I'll show you some right here. You put the milk into a jar and it ferments and you get what's called clabber. And then what they would do, because it becomes acidic, the whey in it becomes acidic, much like in sauerkraut I have right here, the juice in that gets lactic acid, or in wine, the same thing. I have a little bit here that had been fermented from pure apple juice, and I'll go into that in some future videos. But if you have any one of these solutions, either clabber or lactic acid from sauerkraut, or starter from wheat, then you put the baking soda into it. It's going to react the same as if you ever, when you were young, well, I always did it when I was young, it was fun to do as a kid, you put baking soda into vinegar and it make a little volcano, it would blow up. And I put a little bit on the plate here, and just to show you very quickly, I'll do it with a little bit of sauerkraut juice. If you put a little bit in a bowl, then add some baking soda, stir it, you see it starts bubbling, and just like it's in vinegar. And that is why Clabber Girl baking powder in the past was used with the milk and sourdough, and when you put it in the loaf, it added an extra boost of air and blew it up a little bigger. And so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to make sourdough a dough and let it ferment overnight, but I'm going to add some baking powder to one and not to the other. And we're going to see if that baking powder causes that dough to rise even further, because it adds an extra boost of air in addition to the starter that I already have, which will break down the gluten, make the nutrients assimilable, and perform the real purpose for a leaven. But to add a little bit of air to it and to neutralize a little bit of the acidity of it will make it more mild. What we're going to find out, though, and we're going to see, is if it actually will keep it from fermenting, because is the acid what's causing the fermenting, or is it something interior that causes that to happen, and the acid is a byproduct and it won't affect it at all. And so we'll have one without baking powder, one with baking powder. What I'm going to do is grind my own wheat, as I always do. But if you don't have a wheat grinder, and let me tell you something, wheat grinder takes the wheat berries and just grinds it, which is what flour is, turns it into flour. The taste is not comparable to anything else, nor are the nutrients. You really should get a grinder at some point. But until then, what you want to do is you want to get ideally organic whole wheat 100% whole grain flour. So when you look at the ingredients on the side, the only thing it says is certified 100% whole grain. This says hard red winter wheat flour, which is ground flour. You use that has all the vitamins in it. Anything else is going to be substandard, not have the vitamins, and maybe not the bran or the germ and the other things that are in the kernel. So I grind the kernel whole, and here we go. Now as that grinds, eventually it comes to an end. speeds up and I shut it off. I want to let it stop so it doesn't squirt flour all over the kitchen. You can try that if that sounds fun to you. You probably try it once without doing it on purpose when you get a grinder. So when I take that out, now you've got your ground flour. Oh, it's very simple. I don't measure because it's not that complicated. You just put some flour in. I'll probably need a pretty big size one since I'm going to divide it in 2 parts. So you put the flour in, and I had a little bit of wheat left over. I'm going to dump that in there. Fill up with water. You can only use purified water or spring water, water with no chlorine or contaminants in it. This is a living process, and so you don't want any chemicals in the water. So this is reverse osmosis water. Takes all the chlorine out. I'm going to put just shy of, what is that, 4 cups in that amount. But, you know, you can always add a little more water. If you get a little too much, you just add a little more flour. You don't want to turn this into a big complicated thing because you're just stirring and making a dough ball. And what I'm going to do is move this out of the way now. Now I have my starter that's already prepared. You're going to need a starter to make any of these products. And what a starter is just wheat dough that has been fermented fully, which takes about 5 days, 4 to 5 days. The magical thing about it, just amazing. It's a supernatural, really magical thing, is that once it's fermented in 4 days or so, when you add a little bit to the new batch, which would take 4 days again to ferment by itself, but when you add a little bit of the starter that's already made, it acts like a jump starter and ferments it overnight. Just speeds it up exponentially. So once you have it, it's going to ferment that immediately overnight. Now, when you're mixing the dough, if you just get a little bit too wet, you're just going to add a little bit more flour to it. No big deal. After you do this a couple, 3 times, you're going to know about the amount that you need. In this instance, I have just a little bit too much moisture in there, so you want to be able to work it. You don't want it dry. But this is the longest part of making bread, and you're going to see that I'm almost done. So it's not very long at all, and it's not very complicated at all. Put about 3 tablespoons of that, or 4 tablespoons of that starter in. It's not really going to matter. You're just jump starting your loaf. And to show you that you really don't even need to add to it and get it activated, I put some flour in there yesterday and it was bubbled to the top this morning, but then I put it in the refrigerator and it went back down. But it won't make any difference. You can take it right out of the refrigerator. Now there's my dough ball, so that's pretty much the main part of making bread. What I'm going to do now is just eye it. I think that's about half. Cut it in half. And now I have one. Let's set that there. And another. I'm going to put that there. Now I just take a dish towel and set in a bowl. This isn't complicated either. Since I'm experimenting, I'm having 2 bowls that are the same size. Put that dish towel in that bowl. I'm going to sprinkle flour. This will make it so it won't stick to the dish towel. These towels are smooth, so they're not going to have little pieces of material to grab onto the dough. Now, what I'm going to do is in this one, I'm going to bring the bowl back, and I'm going to take about 1/3 of a teaspoon. It's pretty small. You know, on a big loaf, 1/2 teaspoon would be enough, so I'll say about 1/4. And we're going to put it in now. I'm just going to sprinkle it over it. Just another pinch. I'm going to work it through. Now, tomorrow, after we see what happens with this, if there's any difference, then I'll take the one that doesn't have anything in it and is fermented fully, and we can put some in it at that time. That was at least 1/4 teaspoon. And this is pretty small. It's a pretty small piece. That's about what you want right there. So, in the bowl that one goes. I'm just putting a little bit of dry flour over the top. And this one we're going to leave just exactly how it is. We'll put a little dry flour over the top so the dish towel does not stick to it. That is bread. Now we bake it about 30 minutes at about 500 degrees, but after it's fermented, because now that real leaven from nature right there is going to completely neutralize that gluten, make the nutrients assimilable, multiple times more assimilable, and turn bread into what bread was supposed to be. That's 100% wheat. The interesting thing is going to be, how does baking soda affect prior to fermentation as at the same time, and then how it would affect it putting it in after the fermentation. The great thing is you're not going to have to sit around waiting. Through the magic of editing, we'll be back in a snap. That wasn't a good snap with flour on my hands. Okay, we're back, and that's been about, I would say, 15 or 16 hours. And so the one that I put the baking soda in is on the right, or on my right, and the one I didn't put it in is here. So let's take a look at them. And if we see, I would say the one with the baking soda is just a little bit more raised, a little bit more puffy, especially around the edges. These edges are still completely, have kind of a groove or a valley in there, and these don't on this one. And so it did have some effect, for sure. What I'm going to do is, rather than bake them right now, I'm going to actually take this one now after it's already fermented and there's lactic acid developed in it, and I'm going to add some baking soda to that now. Dump it out. We can see that. And I'm going to take a container, put just a tiny, tiny bit of purified water in there. That might actually be a little too much. I'm going to take 1/3 teaspoon of baking powder. I'm just wetting it a little bit so that it can disperse through the loaf a little bit better. Now you can see that baking powder. I'm doing it like this right now just because I want it to disperse through a lot more. I'll put a pinch also of powder. I definitely want it to, I would say overall that's going to be about 1/3 teaspoon. And so I'll put that through the loaf really well. And then we'll come back in about 3 hours and see the difference of putting a little baking soda in from the start as compared to putting it in after a fermentation is done. Now this is a different type of fermentation. This won't be the one that reduces the gluten, unlocks the nutrients, takes overnight. This is much more akin to just a chemical reaction that's going to create air and a rise. The regular fermentation is already done. So I'm going to stick that right there. A little flour on top so this doesn't stick. And then I'm going to cover it back, and we'll come back in a few hours and see how that one turned out. We'll leave this one alone for now and let it ferment just a little bit longer. Now just quickly, what's the difference between baking soda and baking powder? Probably a lot of people have wondered that. Baking soda is actually sodium bicarbonate, which reacts with an acid, which would be lactic acid in this case, and creates bubbles. And so that's what a sodium bicarbonate is, which is baking soda. Baking powder is sodium bicarbonate mixed with an acid already that isn't activated until you add moisture to it. And so that's really the difference. It has, either one of them has everything in it, and when you add water and put some moisture in there, it actually then begins to bubble. And this one is adding to an acid that's already in there, and then it will begin to bubble. So that's really the difference between the two. But let's come back in just a little bit. We'll see the difference. Maybe about, I'll say about 3 or 4 hours, and I'll let you see the difference. Okay, we're back now, and that's been about 4.5 hours, somewhere right around there. And this is the one that had the baking soda in it from the very start. And this one is the one that I put it in with the balls, the smaller ball, and it rose about as high as the other one. And it's possible it could have been up a little higher earlier. I stepped out for a bit, but it's still, you can see where there's been there are bubble areas off the top, and that is just about the same height as the other one. So I think the thing now is just to see what they taste like and how they compare when you cut them open. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have to bake them separately to use the Dutch oven, but I want to keep everything the same because I have another loaf that I did with no baking soda whatsoever, and for the density to see that. So we'll put that loaf with the baking soda after the fermentation right there, and just cut a small little cut right there, so when it rises it will spread right there. And I have the oven already heated up, so all I'm going to do, I preheated it to 500, drop the bread in, put the lid on, and it's a smaller loaf, so probably won't take quite as long as the 30 minutes I've been baking with bigger loaves, but we'll come back in about 23 minutes, 24, 25, right around there, and take a look at that, and then we'll do the other one, cut them open, and let you see the differences and the difference between not using baking soda at all. Okay, it's right around 25 minutes, and we're going to open the oven, take a look at it, and you can see the crust is not really brown, really dark brown, or even in between yet. So we're going to leave the lid off for about another 5 minutes, and then we'll bake the other one and let that one cool down. Okay, it's been about 5 minutes, so what we're going to do is set up a cooling rack for that loaf, take that out, and these gloves are a lifesaver. You really need gloves like that. Trying to pick that up with a dish towel and then have the heat come through when it didn't right at first can be brutal. You know, I have my handy way of picking these out with a fork. You can barely see the holes. It's a great way to get the bread out. And so now I'm going to start over with another piece of parchment paper. Makes it really easy. Now when you take your loaf out, what you don't want to do is knock it on the floor. That wouldn't be good. I'm sure that's happened. I would have never done such a thing. But that loaf there is the one that was had the baking soda in it after the fermentation. And this one is the one that had it in from the very start, all overnight. Just going to compare and see if there's any difference once we cut in. Almost lost a fork. Once we cut in to each one of them and see if there's any difference, and then with a normal loaf that just uses the leaven method of only the starter, which is what real leavening is. The ancient word had to do with creating a boiling, but that is a symptom of it. But really what happens in a real leavening is that amazing process is done to that wheat that allows the amino acids to be assimilated and not remain in a gum form. And also the plant defenses get wiped out, the nutrients become way more assimilable. So that's really leavening. But to get a puffiness to your loaf, we're going to see if adding a little baking soda like that is going to make a big difference. So we're going to bake this one, then come back and let you see the differences between the two. Okay, we're back, and actually at 25 minutes, I took the lid off just like the other one. So these should be just about equal. I'll take that out, then look for my forks. And I'm going to move this one over. That was fermented after the fact. And this was done before. And really, from the looks of these two loaves, this one, move this over a little bit where you can see. I'm going to let it cool before I cut into it. But it's actually a little higher and puffier. But you'll really be able to tell once you cut open by the how much air is in the bread itself. So this one is after the fact, and this one's before. I'm going to let these cool, and then we'll come back. We'll cut into them. We'll see what it looks like. Okay, the other one now has had some time to cool off. So I'm going to take both these loaves and set on a cutting board. And this one was the one that was fermented after. I'm just going to cut in about 1/3 of the way. Okay, and then I'm going to do the same with this one. This one was fermented all night. And this one's still fairly warm. You can see that steam come off of there. And this one that was fermented overnight, you can see how it looks. And I would say it's a little more, just a little more airy, but not a whole lot. I'll show you these close up. You can see a loaf that I've had with just fermented with the starter. It's similar, but it's a little more airy. And you have to remember the flour that I'm using is the entire wheat kernel, so it has the bran, the germ, the endosperm, everything's in there. So it's a very heavy flour. There's something in the past, more often done in the past, called bolting, where you strain out that bran and you leave, you take the heavy parts out and you leave it light so you can do pastries and cake and things like that, but you want the vitamins in it. And this, I would have to say, I'm going to have to taste it now to see how it tastes in comparison before I give you a whole recommendation. So let me do that. So now the real test is to taste the bread. And this was fermented, had the baking soda added after the fact. And this one, it was there overnight. So I'm going to cut a slice. It's still pretty warm. And there you have it. And to be honest, I don't see a great appreciable difference to using baking soda involved with sourdough as compared to the regular starter to ferment it and raise it and add a lift inside. You know, originally baking soda was used with things like exactly what the name implies, clabber girl, which is clabber, which is soured unpasteurized milk to create the acid. And it was used in place of things like yeast when they got completely away from the natural fermentation of what sourdough is, the amazing nutrition properties. But it was another alternative, and to put in things like biscuits and things like that, to have a quick air added into the biscuit or the bread by adding essentially what happens when you add vinegar to baking soda. It goes, well, the same thing when you add it to, well, it wouldn't taste so good in bread, but when you add it to an acidified milk, which is essentially curds and whey. If you remember the old Little Miss Muffet sat on the tuffet, curds and whey are what happen when you have a raw milk that ferments and turns essentially the same as what sauerkraut does. And so when you have that lactic acid solution and you put that in with also some baking soda, that provides what they've come to call leaven, but really leaven is the property of what happens to this. As far as I'm concerned, before anything like that's put in, it's separate completely from air because it degrades the gluten and makes it so the nutrients are assimilable and makes it way more healthy. So that's my test. That's my scientific experiment. It's time to taste it. Tasting's always a little hard on camera. I'm pretty good at it though. The main thing I'm trying to see is if that little bit of baking soda that was put in changed the sourness of the bread at all. It tastes great. It tastes just as good as any of the other bread. And I really think, even though that's a heavy flour, that it's worth trying. And tell me what you think in the comments down below. You know, to each his own. I think it obviously has a little bit of a lift more because it's going to, because it underwent that process. But give it a try yourself. Let me know in the comments down below. Give me a like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.